The email arrived at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, exactly 7 months and 12 days after they eliminated my position. Leonard Hoffman, clipped British accent, professionally polite. Ms. Dalton, we've uncovered a substantial irregularity with Nova Pharmaceuticals' regulatory status. Would you be available for consultation? I was reviewing case files in my converted loft workspace in Boston's Seaport District, watching early morning fog roll across the harbor. 7 months ago, I'd been Nova's chief regulatory compliance officer. Now I was about to discover they'd created a $375 million catastrophe. If you're new here and enjoying these powerful stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Let me know in the comments what part of today's story touched you most. My name is Vivian Dalton, 46 years old, and I've spent 12 years navigating the labyrinth of pharmaceutical regulatory compliance. Before that, I worked 14 years at the FDA as a field investigator, shutting down facilities that thought they could cut corners on safety protocols. Same principles, different perspective. When compliance fails in civil service, you issue warnings. When compliance fails in pharmaceuticals, people die and companies disintegrate. The morning that triggered this entire situation was a Wednesday too. Jameson Reed strutted into our quarterly regulatory review meeting and labeled my compliance division bureaucratic overhead with diminishing returns on investment. I recognized immediately that Nova Pharmaceuticals was accelerating toward disaster. Jameson possessed that distinctive Silicon Valley arrogance you encounter everywhere these days. Custom-tailored blazer, smart ring on his finger, and the unshakable confidence born from never experiencing genuine professional failure. Nephew of CEO Douglas Ellington, freshly appointed Vice President of Strategic Innovation, whatever that signified in a 112-year-old pharmaceutical manufacturing corporation. He didn't offer handshakes during introductions. He nodded curtly and used phrases like paradigm disruption and operational velocity while scrolling through his tablet like he'd personally invented efficiency. Nobody invited him to present that morning. Nobody prevented him either. He displayed a presentation titled Modernizing Legacy Departments, Initiative 1. Initiative 1, as it happened, meant dismantling my division. I'd served as Nova's designated FDA liaison officer for 12 years. That represented 12 years constructing safety frameworks from nothing, monitoring regulatory transformations sweep through pharmaceutical manufacturing like tsunamis, cataloging every catastrophic scenario the FDA and state boards could conceivably deploy against U.S. I had 6 federal inspections under my supervision with 0 citations. My documentation system was organized like military intelligence archives. Everything coded, time-stamped, cross-indexed. Jameson didn't understand what FDA liaison designation actually meant. I observed him searching it on his phone during the presentation. That morning, he stood there beaming with his uncle's corporate card, declared compliance an antiquated support mechanism, and proposed we streamline oversight using algorithmic monitoring platforms. My department was superfluous, he announced, overfunded. My $94,000 salary plus $18,200 in comprehensive benefits terminated. That's $112,200 in annual cost reduction, he proclaimed. Nearly an entire digital marketing campaign budget. Someone genuinely applauded. I didn't react. I simply closed my laptop and inquired, "Is this meeting concluded?" Jameson departed with his spreadsheet and a self-satisfied expression. I returned to my office and retrieved a fresh archive box. I wasn't fury. I wasn't even shock. It was procedure, FDA investigator instinct. When someone's preparing to commit a catastrophic error, you document everything and prepare for the inevitable fallout. I began copying files. Every system credential, every regulatory designation, every legal instrument where my name appeared as the authorized representative. Most personnel at Nova didn't comprehend that our entire FDA framework still mandated my formal authorization. Every quarterly submission, every manufacturing certification, every inspection response had Vivian Dalton listed as primary regulatory contact. No successor had been appointed. Nobody could supersede me without executive board approval and formal reassignment documentation filed within 28 calendar days. But Jameson didn't know that. His uncle Douglas, the CEO, probably didn't either. Initially, I anticipated someone would intervene. Perhaps HR would raise concerns. Perhaps Douglas, who once described me as the person who prevents federal intervention, might object. But silence. HR transmitted the restructuring paperwork 6 days later. My new designation: Senior Operations Coordinator. My system access was restricted. My invitations to executive meetings vanished immediately. I acknowledged without protest. No objections. Even congratulated Jameson when he celebrated achieving his initial efficiency milestone. He actually sent me a celebration GIF and called me Viv D. So I printed the original FDA liaison designation letter, the one executed by the board in 2017, and forwarded it to my personal email with a timestamp. Then I printed 3 copies. One went into my home safe, another into a binder labeled Regulatory Continuity Protocols, Reference Archive, and discreetly positioned it in the legal department's records room. 3rd cabinet, upper shelf. I didn't inform anyone. See, people believe revenge requires theatrics. Dramatic resignations and impassioned declarations about being underappreciated. But nobody values a tripwire either until someone activates it. The genuine elegance resided in Section 8.7 of our Operational Continuity Framework, a provision I'd inserted 5 years earlier after observing a competitor absorb $4.20 million in penalties for improper regulatory handoff procedures. It specified that any modification to the designated FDA liaison must be formally reassigned through board resolution within 28 calendar days, or the designation becomes legally void retroactive to the vacancy date. Pharmaceutical compliance penalties begin at $12,000 per day for minor infractions. After 120 days of continued violation, they escalate to $35,000 per day. The mathematics become devastating quickly. Jameson had no comprehension. Legal hadn't verified. Douglas simply authorized the efficiency report without examining the specifics. 8 weeks after the restructuring, I submitted my resignation. Straightforward and professional. Effective 14 days from today, I will be departing my position at Nova Pharmaceuticals. That's all. No theatrics, no exit interview ultimatums, no company-wide message about feeling devalued. They processed it like standard paperwork, deactivated my credentials by day's end. The IT request was so hasty they misspelled my surname and neglected to update the regulatory registry. My daughter Elena called that evening to check my status. She's a senior at Boston University studying biochemical engineering. Brilliant student, more perceptive than her mother in many aspects, but she inherited my methodical approach. Oh, are you certain about this? What about my final year tuition? Graduation's approaching. Trust me, sweetheart. This situation will resolve favorably. Your mother didn't spend 14 years at the FDA without mastering contingency planning. Sounds like you've prepared something. Just adhering to proper protocols. Sometimes that's sufficient. That weekend I updated my profile on the Federal Regulatory Database, designating my certification to active, corporate designation terminated, no replacement documented, effective day 42. Then I registered as an independent consultant specializing in crisis regulatory remediation. 36 hours later, my phone began ringing. By Tuesday, I had 6 legitimate inquiries. 3 from law firms representing companies facing regulatory challenges, 2 from specialized consulting organizations, and 1 from a British pharmaceutical conglomerate that specialized in acquiring American mid-tier manufacturers. That final inquiry made me smile. Across Boston, Nova continued operating without interruption. No transition protocols, no knowledge documentation, no successor training. Jameson was already designing Initiative 2 of his optimization framework. Douglas began discussing the company's new agile methodology in trade publications. Nobody noticed the compliance clock advancing toward day 29. I established operations in a renovated loft space in the Seaport District on Congress Street. Open workspace, espresso machine that functioned consistently, and panoramic views of Boston Harbor. Monthly rent was $2,400. My initial consulting contract paid $320 per hour. The economics surpassed my previous salary substantially. Every morning I'd walk downstairs and purchase coffee from Margaret, elderly woman who'd operated the corner cafe for 40 years. We'd discuss local news, weather patterns, occasionally business matters. She knew I'd departed Nova but didn't probe. FDA investigators understand when someone prefers not discussing work. You know, Vivian, Margaret mentioned one morning, my husband worked pharmaceutical quality control for 38 years. Never compromised standards once. When they brought in those efficiency consultants, he said something I'll always remember. What's that? The new generation thinks they can improve what the previous generation built. But they never question why the previous generation built it that specific way. Day 56 of Nova's compliance violation, I received a call from a biotech company in Connecticut. Their regulatory officer had resigned unexpectedly, and they were confronting an FDA inspection in 6 weeks. Complete panic. I quoted them $385 per hour plus expenses for a 5-week emergency engagement. They accepted before I finished explaining. Day 89. I was traveling to North Carolina assisting a pharmaceutical packaging facility navigate a de-investigation. Their previous compliance team had missed a controlled substance reporting deadline. The potential penalties were in the millions. My assignment was to reconstruct their documentation trail and demonstrate good faith compliance efforts. FDA investigator precision and methodical approach. Same skills, different application. Day 118. The escalating penalty structure activated for Nova. Not that anyone there recognized it yet. Pharmaceutical compliance violations become exponentially more expensive after 120 days. The daily penalty jumped from $12,000 to $35,000. Still invisible, still accumulating, still retroactive to day 29. Day 127. I was back in Boston when Elena called with updates. She'd been accepted into Boston University's Accelerated Regulatory Sciences program. Emerging field, expanding demand, excellent career prospects. Guess who inspired me to explore it, she mentioned. Your mother's influencing you. More like I realize there's career stability in preventing disasters. Plus, the starting compensation is impressive. Professor explains that with all these international corporations acquiring American pharmaceutical companies, they need professionals who understand both perspectives. Elena was correct. The pharmaceutical industry was transforming. Foreign corporations with substantial capital were acquiring American manufacturers, but they needed local expertise to navigate federal regulations. Someone who understood both the technical requirements and the business implications. Day 156, Nova announced the transaction of the decade. Press release distributed at 8:30 a.m. Nova Pharmaceuticals to be acquired by Cheltenham Biopharma Group for $375 million. The announcement made the Boston Business Journal front page. Douglas was quoted extensively about Nova's innovative operational transformation under new leadership. Jameson was quoted too. He'd positioned himself as the architect of Nova's streamlined operational model that attracted international attention. The article mentioned his strategic elimination of redundant legacy departments as a key factor in Cheltenham's interest. I read it over my morning espresso at the cafe. Margaret saw me reviewing the business journal. Positive developments? He inquired. You could interpret it that way. Sometimes patience yields results. My husband used to mention something else about the pharmaceutical business. The lab that runs the hottest produces the fastest results. But if you don't follow proper protocols, the entire operation collapses. Day 174. The due diligence team from Cheltenham Biopharma Group arrived in Boston. Professional, meticulous, and led by a gentleman named Leonard Hoffman, who held advanced degrees in biochemistry and regulatory law and possessed the attention to detail that made British pharmaceutical standards legendary. His team included Catherine Shaw, a compliance specialist who'd spent 19 years auditing American acquisitions for European pharmaceutical companies. They spent the initial 2 weeks reviewing financial records, operational metrics, and manufacturing protocols. Everything appeared pristine. Jameson had prepared impressive presentations about streamlined operations and reduced overhead. The figures were compelling. The timeline was aggressive. Douglas had already begun discussing integration strategies. Cheltenham executives were optimistic. This appeared exactly like the lean, efficient American pharmaceutical manufacturer they desired in their portfolio. Nova's management team was confident. Legal had reviewed everything multiple times. The transaction was scheduled for closing in 3 weeks. Day 197. Exactly 28 compliance cycles since my designation had been terminated without replacement. Catherine Shaw was in Nova's legal records room cross-referencing regulatory filings with personnel documentation. Routine due diligence, nothing exceptional. She wasn't searching for problems, just verifying that all certifications were current and properly maintained. That's when she discovered my binder. Third cabinet, upper shelf, exactly where I'd positioned it 5 months earlier. Regulatory Continuity Protocols. Reference Archive. Catherine opened it and began reading. The original FDA Liaison Designation Letter. The Operational Continuity Framework with Section 8.7 highlighted. The timeline requirements. The board resolution from 2017 that was never superseded. Catherine spent 2 hours examining every document. Then cross-referenced the dates with Nova's current regulatory registry. Then she called Leonard Hoffman. The mathematics were straightforward and devastating. Day 29 through day 197 equals 169 days of compliance violation. First 120 days at $12,000 per day equals $1,440,000. Remaining 49 days at $35,000 per day equals $1,715,000. Total exposure. $3,155,000 and increasing at $35,000 per day until resolved. But the situation deteriorated further. Because no replacement had been designated, every regulatory filing, every manufacturing certification, every compliance document submitted during those 169 days was legally invalid. Nova had been misrepresenting ITIS regulatory standing to customers, insurers and potential buyers for over 5 months, including Cheltenham Biopharma Group. Day 197, Thursday morning, 10:45 a.m. Catherine Shaw walked into the Nova boardroom carrying a portfolio that would destroy everything Jameson had constructed. "Who is Vivian Dalton?" she inquired, placing the portfolio on the conference table. Jameson appeared confused. "She previously worked here. We restructured her position last year as part of our operational optimization. But she remains listed as your designated FDA liaison officer," Catherine stated, opening the portfolio. "According to your federal registry and this documentation, she remains the authorized representative for all regulatory filings." Douglas leaned forward. "That's impossible. We handled her transition months ago." Catherine wasn't displaying warmth. "Where is the board resolution replacing her? The formal reassignment documentation? The updated federal notifications?" Silence. Jameson began typing frantically on his tablet. Douglas was already reaching for his phone. Legal was summoned from another meeting. HR scrambled to locate records that didn't exist. "We assumed the transition was automatic when we restructured her role," someone from HR offered weakly. Catherine shook her head. "Federal regulatory designations are never automatic. They require explicit board action and formal replacement within 28 calendar days. You've been operating without valid regulatory authority for exactly 169 days, over 8 complete compliance cycles." Leonard Hoffman, who had been quietly reviewing Catherine's findings, looked up from his laptop. "This represents a material misrepresentation of regulatory standing during preliminary negotiations." Jameson attempted to salvage the situation. "It's just paperwork. We can rectify this immediately. Bring Vivian back, file the forms, proceed forward." "No," Leonard said firmly. "You cannot retroactively rectify federal compliance violations. Pharmaceutical compliance penalties escalate after 120 days. Your current exposure is $3,155,000, increasing by $35,000 daily." The room went completely silent. Douglas's complexion had gone ashen. "Surely we can resolve this. It's a procedural oversight." Catherine opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the table. "Your compliance violations create significant liability exposure for any acquiring entity. But more concerning is the pattern of misrepresentation. Ms. Dalton left detailed documentation showing that proper procedures were available and ignored." She clicked to the next slide. "Section 8.7 of your own operational continuity framework. authored by Ms. Dalton, explicitly outlines the 28-day requirement. This was not an oversight. This was negligence. Jameson's voice cracked slightly. We didn't see that documentation. It was filed in your legal records with clear labeling, Catherine replied. Ms. Dalton followed proper procedure. Your organization did not. Leonard closed his laptop slowly. This is a material breach of due diligence representations. We need to pause acquisition proceedings pending legal review. Douglas stood up abruptly. Mr. Hoffman, surely we can work through this. The transaction is scheduled to close next week. Mr. Ellington, your company has been operating in federal violation for over 5 months while representing full compliance to potential buyers. This creates exposure for Cheltenham Biopharma Group that we cannot accept. Jameson attempted one final time. What if we bring Vivian back immediately? Full reinstatement, whatever it requires. Catherine consulted her notes. Ms. Dalton is listed as an independent consultant. She may not be available for employment. That afternoon Leonard called me directly. Professional courtesy, he explained, wanted to understand the timeline of my departure and the transition procedures that were supposed to be followed. I was in my loft workspace reviewing a compliance manual for a client in Pennsylvania. The call was anticipated. I'd been tracking days on my calendar, watching the violation accumulate like compounding interest. Ms. Dalton, this is Leonard Hoffman from Cheltenham Biopharma Group. We're reviewing Nova Pharmaceuticals' regulatory standing as part of acquisition due diligence. Yes, sir. How can I assist you? Can you confirm the timeline of your departure and any transition procedures that were implemented? I provided him the dates. Restructured on day 1, resigned effective day 56, final day 70. Explained the proper procedures, confirmed that no formal replacement had ever been designated. When he inquired if I'd attempted to notify Nova of the compliance gap, I mentioned the binder. Regulatory continuity protocols. Reference archive, I told him. Third cabinet, upper shelf in legal records. Should still be there. We found it, Leonard said. Very thorough documentation. Section 8.7 of the Operational Continuity Framework appears to address this exact scenario. Yes, sir. I wrote that provision in 2017 after observing a competitor absorb $4.20 million in penalties for improper regulatory handoff. Seemed like prudent risk management. Indeed. Are you currently available for consulting engagement? Depends on the scope and timeline. What did you have in mind? Day 198, Friday morning. Leonard called an emergency meeting. Douglas, Jameson, the board, legal counsel, everyone who mattered. He laid out the situation in terms that left no room for interpretation. Nova Pharmaceuticals has been operating in violation of federal regulatory requirements for 169 days. The regulatory penalties currently total $3,155,000 and increase by $35,000 daily until resolved. Jameson started to interrupt. Leonard held up his hand. Furthermore, every compliance document submitted during this period is legally invalid. This includes manufacturing certifications, FDA filings, and regulatory representations made to Cheltenham Biopharma Group during preliminary negotiations. Douglas's voice was barely audible. What does this mean for the acquisition? It means the acquisition is terminated, Leonard said flatly. Effective immediately. Our legal team has identified material misrepresentation that creates unacceptable liability exposure. Jameson looked like he might collapse. Surely we can resolve this. Bring Vivian back, fix the paperwork, move forward. Trust has been compromised, Leonard replied. Ms. Dalton provided proper documentation and procedures. Your organization chose to ignore them. This was not an oversight. This was a failure of corporate governance. The Cheltenham team was packed and departed by afternoon. Their final ACT was to formally notify Nova's board that due diligence had revealed material compliance violations and misrepresentation of regulatory standing. The press release went out Monday morning. Cheltenham Biopharma Group withdraws from Nova Pharmaceuticals acquisition due to unresolved regulatory compliance issues. Nova's stock opened down 22% and kept falling. By market close, IT had dropped 41% in a single day. The business press picked up the story immediately. Headlines like "Compliance Failure Kills $375 million Deal" and "When Optimization Goes Catastrophically Wrong." Tuesday morning my phone rang again. Leonard this time. "Miss Dalton? Cheltenham Biopharma Group is interested in retaining your services for a comprehensive regulatory review of our North American operations. 18-month contract, $320 per hour. Full autonomy over methodology and timeline. Are you available?" I looked around my loft workspace, espresso machine that functioned consistently, view of Boston Harbor, and a stack of consulting contracts that had quadrupled my previous salary. "Yes, sir. I'm available." Day 201 Wednesday afternoon. Douglas Ellington announced his immediate retirement. The press release cited personal reasons and desire to pursue other interests. The board called an emergency meeting to discuss leadership transitions and operational restructuring. Jameson was requested to submit his resignation by Friday. No press release for that one. Thursday morning, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. "Vivian, this is Jameson. Hope we can connect about industry best practices. No hard feelings." I read it twice, then deleted it. The local business press had captured the story. Boston Business Journal ran a feature titled "The $375 million Mistake: How Nova Pharmaceuticals Lost the Deal of a Lifetime." They interviewed compliance experts, corporate attorneys, and business school professors. Everyone had opinions about proper due diligence and the importance of regulatory oversight. Nobody interviewed me. That was acceptable. I had work to do. Elena called that weekend, excited about her acceptance into Boston University's Regulatory Sciences program. She'd been following the Nova story in the business news. They're using this as a case study in my business ethics class. Professor says it's a perfect example of how cutting corners on compliance can destroy shareholder value. What's your perspective on it? That someone at Nova knew exactly what they were doing when they wrote those procedures, and someone else ignored them because they thought they knew better. Smart daughter. Your mother's proud of you. I've been thinking about specializing in pharmaceutical regulatory compliance. Professor says the field's growing, especially with all the international acquisitions happening. Excellent choice. There's always demand for professionals who can keep companies out of trouble. 7 months later, I relocated into my new office at Cheltenham Biopharma Group North American headquarters in Boston. Corner office, 22nd floor, view of Boston Harbor and the financial district. My assignment was straightforward. Review compliance procedures for all Cheltenham's U.S. pharmaceutical facilities and recommend improvements. The work was familiar, but the scale was impressive. 14 manufacturing plants across 9 states, each with different regulatory requirements and local compliance challenges. Cheltenham wanted a unified system that could handle federal oversight, state regulations, and international standards. Nova Pharmaceuticals was officially delisted from the NASDAQ. The company had been sold in pieces to various buyers, none of whom wanted the compliance liability that came with the corporate entity. The original headquarters building was leased to a biotechnology startup. Most of the manufacturing equipment went to a competitor in New Jersey. The final regulatory settlement was announced the following month. Nova's insurance covered most of the $4.10 million in penalties, but the company's reputation was finished. Douglas relocated to Florida. Jameson's LinkedIn profile said he was exploring new opportunities in strategic innovation consulting. 1 year later, I was sitting in my Cheltenham office reviewing the final compliance report. 14 facilities, unified procedures, 0 regulatory violations, projected annual savings of $3.40 million through improved efficiency and reduced legal exposure. Leonard had already inquired about extending the contract. Cheltenham was expanding their U.S. operations and wanted me to help evaluate potential acquisitions. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. She'd just finished her senior year and was starting a summer internship with a regulatory consulting firm in Washington, D.C. Following in Mom's footsteps, she wrote, "Turns out there really is career security in keeping people out of trouble." That evening, I walked down to the cafe for coffee. Margaret was closing up but poured me a cup anyway. "How's the new position?" he inquired. "Can't complain. Turns out experience is worth something after all. Funny how that works. You know what my husband used to say about the pharmaceutical business? What's that? The person who knows why the protocol was written that way will always have work. The person who thinks they can improve it without understanding why will always be searching for work. Some professionals spend their careers trying to be noticed. I spent mine knowing where the regulatory tripwires were located. My mistake at Nova was assuming someone else would read the compliance manual when I departed. They didn't replace me, they erased me. And like any good regulatory protocol, the consequences were built right into the system. Jameson had called compliance bureaucratic overhead with diminishing returns on investment. Turns out regulatory knowledge is what keeps companies alive when the FDA comes calling and the lawyers start circling. The following week, I received an interesting phone call from a consulting firm in Chicago. They'd heard about my work with Cheltenham and wanted to discuss a partnership opportunity. Their client list included 7 major pharmaceutical manufacturers, all facing similar challenges with regulatory modernization. The offer was compelling. Equity partnership, flexibility to choose my projects, and a base compensation that made my previous salary look like entry-level wages. But I declined. Cheltenham had just identified 3 potential acquisitions in the American market, and Leonard had personally requested that I lead the regulatory due diligence teams. The work was challenging, the compensation was excellent, and most importantly, I'd finally found an organization that understood the value of proper compliance infrastructure. Elena graduated that spring with honors. She'd been offered positions at 3 different consulting firms, all specializing in pharmaceutical regulatory compliance. She chose the firm in Washington, D.C., primarily because they focused on helping smaller biotech companies navigate FDA approval processes. She said during our celebration dinner, "I've been thinking about what happened at Nova." What about it? I wasn't just about Jameson being arrogant or Douglas being careless. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what compliance actually means. Go on. They treated it like a cost center instead of a risk management function. They saw your salary as an expense instead of insurance against catastrophic failure. Exactly. And that's why companies like Nova fail and companies like Cheltenham succeed. 6 months into my Cheltenham contract, I was reviewing a potential acquisition target in California. Small pharmaceutical manufacturer, excellent products, solid financials, but some concerning gaps in their compliance documentation. During the preliminary review, I discovered their regulatory officer had retired 3 months earlier. No replacement had been designated. The timeline requirements hadn't been followed. The violations were accumulating daily. I called Leonard immediately. "We have a situation," I explained. "Their compliance structure has the same fundamental flaw that destroyed Nova." "How severe?" "Current exposure is approximately $1.80 million and climbing. But it's fixable if we act quickly." "What do you recommend?" "We make the acquisition contingent on immediate compliance remediation. I'll need 3 weeks on-site to reconstruct their documentation and establish proper protocols. Then we renegotiate the purchase price to reflect the liability exposure." Leonard was quiet for a moment. "This is exactly why we hired you. Proceed with your recommendation." 3 weeks later, I'd restructured their entire compliance framework. The acquisition proceeded at a renegotiated price that saved Cheltenham $47 million. The target company's management was grateful we'd identified the problem before the FDA did. Everyone won except the lawyers who would have billed thousands of hours defending against federal violations. Word spread quickly in the pharmaceutical industry. The woman who'd brought down the Nova deal was now helping Cheltenham build an empire. My phone started ringing with offers from other companies, other consulting firms, other opportunities. I declined most of them. The work with Cheltenham was exactly what I'd spent my entire career preparing for. One call I did accept was from the FDA. They were revising their guidance documents for pharmaceutical compliance designations and wanted my input on preventing situations like the Nova disaster. I spent 2 days in Washington, D.C. working with their policy team. The resulting guidance document included specific language requiring companies to maintain documented succession plans for all designated regulatory officers. They named it the Dalton Protocol, though I'd asked them not to. Back in Boston, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Morning coffee at Margaret's Cafe, Full days reviewing compliance frameworks, evenings overlooking the harbor. Elena called regularly with stories from her new position. She was thriving, helping small biotech companies navigate the complex FDA approval process. One evening, about 18 months after the Nova situation, I received an unexpected email. It was from Douglas Ellington. The subject line read, "Overdue apology." I almost deleted it, but curiosity won. "Vivian, I know this email is long overdue and I don't expect a response. I've spent the past year in retirement, reflecting on my career and the mistakes I made. The Nova situation was my responsibility. I should have questioned Jameson's efficiency initiatives. I should have understood what your position actually meant for the company. I should have read the documentation you left behind. I've been following your work with Cheltenham. You've built something remarkable there. I wanted you to know that I understand now what we lost when we let you go. IT wasn't just your expertise. It was your institutional knowledge, your attention to detail, and your commitment to doing things the right way. I hope you're doing well. You deserved better than what Nova gave you." I read it twice, then filed it away. No response necessary. Some situations don't require closure, just acknowledgement. 2 years after leaving Nova, I was sitting in a conference room at Cheltenham's London headquarters. Leonard had invited me to present our North American compliance framework to the global executive team. The presentation covered 14 facilities, 3 successful acquisitions, 0 regulatory violations, and projected savings of $8.70 million annually. The CEO, Jeffrey Randolph, asked the final question. "Ms. Dalton, your work has been exceptional. But I'm curious about something. The Nova situation. Did you know what would happen when you left that documentation in their legal records?" I chose my words carefully. "Sir, I knew that proper procedures existed and that ignoring them would have consequences. My responsibility was to ensure that information was available and properly documented. What Nova chose to do with that information was their decision." He smiled. "Quite right. Well, I'm pleased to inform you that the board has approved a new position. Vice President of Global Regulatory Compliance. We'd like you to consider it. The role would involve overseeing compliance for all Cheltenham operations worldwide." I accepted. 3 months later, I was moving into my new office at Cheltenham's London headquarters. The view overlooked the Thames. My salary had increased to a number I'd never imagined when I was working at Nova. My team included 47 compliance professionals across 12 countries. Elena called to congratulate me. You've come a long way from that loft workspace in Boston. It's not about how far you've come. It's about staying true to your principles even when others don't understand their value. That's what I'm learning in this industry. The companies that succeed are the ones that treat compliance as a strategic advantage, not a necessary evil. You've taught me that. I'm glad. Never compromise on doing things the right way, even when it's not appreciated. Eventually, people figure out what matters. Back in Boston, the Nova story had become legendary in business school case studies. Harvard Business School published a detailed case analysis titled "When Efficiency Kills Value: The Nova Pharmaceuticals Compliance Failure." The case study examined every decision point, every missed warning sign, every consequence that could have been avoided. They interviewed former Nova employees, industry experts, and regulatory officials. They requested an interview with me. I declined. The facts spoke for themselves. One section of the case study focused on Jameson's efficiency initiative. The analysis was brutal. By eliminating a $112,200 annual expense, management created a $375 million liability and destroyed the company's reputation. The return on investment was negative infinity. Another section examined the documentation I'd left behind. The case study praised the thoroughness of the compliance framework and noted that every warning, every procedure, every requirement had been clearly documented and accessible. The failure wasn't in the system. The failure was in the people who chose to ignore it. Business school professors began using the Nova case to teach lessons about institutional knowledge, regulatory risk, and the hidden costs of efficiency initiatives. It became a standard reference in courses on corporate governance, risk management, and pharmaceutical regulation. 5 years after leaving Nova, I was invited to speak at a pharmaceutical industry conference in Philadelphia. The topic was building sustainable compliance cultures in acquisition environments. The audience included CEOs, compliance officers, and industry consultants from companies across North America and Europe. I stood at the podium and looked out at 300 professionals who understood that compliance wasn't overhead. It was survival. I started with a question. How many of you have been told that your department is too expensive, too bureaucratic, or too resistant to change? Nearly every hand in the room went up. And how many of you have detailed documentation showing exactly why your procedures exist and what happens when they're ignored? Fewer hands remained up. That's the problem. We know our work is critical, but we don't always document it in ways that survive our departure. We don't build systems that prove their own value when we're not there to defend them. I spent 45 minutes walking them through the principles I'd learned over my career. Document everything. Build consequences into your frameworks. Make the cost of ignoring procedures impossible to miss. Create paper trails that survive restructuring. And most importantly, never assume that people will do the right thing just because it's the right thing. The standing ovation surprised me. Afterward, dozens of people wanted to discuss their situations. Compliance officers who felt undervalued. Professionals who were fighting to maintain standards in companies focused on cost cutting. People who needed to know they weren't alone. One young woman approached me near the end. Her name was Julia, and she worked for a mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturer in Oregon. Ms. Dalton, I'm in exactly the situation you described. My company just hired a new efficiency consultant who says my department is redundant. I've been designated regulatory officer for 8 years. They want to replace me with a software system. What did you tell them? I explained the timeline requirements, the designation procedures, the legal implications. They said they'd handle it. And I don't think they understand what they're doing. I looked at her carefully. Do you have your designation documentation? Yes. Is it accessible to whoever comes after you? I have it in my files, but I don't know if anyone would find it. Then make sure they can find it. Document every procedure, every requirement, every consequence. Put it somewhere that can't be ignored. And then trust that the system will protect itself. She nodded slowly. Like you did at Nova. Like I did at Nova. 6 months later, Julia emailed me. Her company had tried to proceed with the efficiency initiative, but their legal team had discovered her documentation. They'd realized the regulatory exposure and canceled the restructuring. She'd been promoted to Director of Regulatory Affairs with a substantial raise. Your advice saved my career, she wrote. More importantly, IT saved my company from making a catastrophic mistake. Back in London, my work with Cheltenham continued to expand. We'd completed 7 acquisitions in North America, each one carefully evaluated for compliance risks. We'd avoided 3 potential disasters by identifying regulatory gaps before finalizing deals. We'd saved the company over $200 million in potential liabilities. Jeffrey called me into his office one afternoon. Vivian, I've been reviewing our acquisition strategy for the next 5 years. We're looking at expansion into Asian markets. I'd like you to build our compliance framework for that region. It's a significant undertaking. New regulatory environments, different cultural approaches to compliance, complex international standards. I'm interested. Good. Because I've also recommended to the board that we create a new executive position. Chief Compliance Officer. Global authority over all regulatory matters. Direct report to me. I'd like you to take it. The promotion came with a seat on the executive committee, equity in the company, and authority over compliance decisions that could stop any acquisition or operational change. It was everything I'd worked for. Everything Nova had told me was redundant. Elena was thriving in Washington, D.C. She'd been promoted twice and was now leading a team of regulatory consultants working with biotech startups. She called one evening with news. I've been offered a position with the FDA. Deputy Director of the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. It's a significant role. That's wonderful. Are you going to take it? Think so. I've learned so much in consulting, but I want to be on the other side now. Shaping policy instead of just navigating it. I think that's the right choice. Your mother's proud of you. I've been thinking about what you told me years ago. About how compliance isn't overhead, it's insurance against catastrophic failure. What about it? I want to make sure the FDA's policies reflect that understanding. Too many companies still see compliance as a burden instead of a strategic advantage. If I can help change that perspective from the inside, I think it's worth doing. That's exactly right. The system only works when everyone understands why it exists. 7 years after leaving Nova, I was sitting in my office at Cheltenham's London headquarters when my assistant informed me I had a visitor. Unexpected, but she said it was important. The visitor was Jameson. He looked older, tired, and significantly less confident than I remembered. "Miss Dalton, thank you for seeing me." I almost said no. "What can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize. In person. For what happened at Nova. I was arrogant and ignorant, and I destroyed something valuable because I didn't understand what I was doing. I listened without interrupting. I've spent the past 7 years working in consulting, and I've seen the same pattern everywhere. Companies bringing in efficiency experts who don't understand the systems they're dismantling. I've become that person who tries to stop them, and nobody listens to me either now. Do you understand? I understand that expertise matters. That institutional knowledge matters. That just because something looks like overhead doesn't mean it's unnecessary. I've learned that lesson expensively. Your uncle learned it too. He did. He wrote me a letter before he passed away last year. Told me the Nova situation was the biggest regret of his career. Not because of the money, but because he'd ignored someone who was trying to protect the company he'd spent his life building. I didn't know he'd passed. I'm sorry. Thank you. I know this doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I destroyed. And I'm sorry. I looked at him for a long moment. Apology accepted. But understand something. I didn't destroy Nova. Your decisions destroyed Nova. I just made sure the consequences were documented. He nodded. I understand that too now. After he left, I sat quietly in my office, looking out over London. The Nova situation had defined a significant chapter of my career, but IT wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of something better. That evening I called Elena. We talked about her new position at the FDA, about the policies she was helping to shape, about the future of pharmaceutical compliance. She said, "Do you ever regret how things happened with Nova? Do I regret that they ignored proper procedures and faced consequences? Do I regret that it had to happen that way? Sometimes. But systems need to prove their value, and sometimes the only way that happens is when someone ignores them and pays the price. That's what I'm learning at the FDA. The regulations exist for reasons, and those reasons are usually written in the mistakes of companies that thought they knew better." Exactly. And your job is to make sure those lessons don't get forgotten. 10 years after leaving Nova, I retired from Cheltenham. I'd built a global compliance framework that protected 23 facilities across 15 countries. I'd helped complete 19 acquisitions without a single major regulatory violation. I'd saved the company an estimated $340 million in potential liabilities. Jeffrey hosted a retirement celebration at Cheltenham's London headquarters. The entire executive committee attended, along with compliance officers from facilities around the world. "Vivian," Jeffrey said in his remarks, "has taught us that compliance isn't a cost. It's the foundation of everything we build. She's shown us that the person who understands why the rules exist will always be more valuable than the person who thinks they can ignore them." Elena flew in from Washington, D.C. for the celebration. She'd been at the FDA for 3 years and had already made significant contributions to pharmaceutical regulatory policy. She said during dinner, "What are you going to do now?" "I'm going to write." "Write what?" "A book about regulatory compliance in the pharmaceutical industry. All the lessons I've learned, all the mistakes I've seen companies make, all the principles that actually matter. That's going to be a bestseller in a very specific audience. That's the only audience that matters." I spent the next 2 years writing. The book was titled The Compliance Imperative: Why Regulatory Expertise Matters More Than Efficiency. It included case studies, frameworks, and detailed analysis of what happens when companies treat compliance as overhead. It included the Nova story, though I changed the names and identifying details. The book was published by a specialized academic press. It sold modestly but found its audience. Pharmaceutical companies bought copies for their compliance teams. Business schools added it to their curricula. Regulatory professionals referenced it in industry publications. One review in a pharmaceutical trade journal captured what I'd hoped to achieve. Dalton's book is essential reading for anyone who makes decisions about regulatory functions. She demonstrates conclusively that compliance expertise isn't overhead. It's the difference between success and catastrophic failure. 12 years after leaving Nova, I was invited to speak at a pharmaceutical compliance conference in Boston. Full circle back where it all started. I stood on stage and looked out at an audience of professionals who understood what I'd learned the hard way. Some people build their careers on being visible, I told them. I built mine on knowing where the regulatory landmines were buried. My mistake at Nova was assuming that expertise would be valued without having to prove its absence. They didn't replace me. They erased me. And the system I'd built protected itself exactly as designed. Business is good. Really good. It just took them $375 million to understand that.